In the last lecture, we saw how France moved towards a revolution on 14th of July 1789. The aristocratic revolution had managed to have the States General summoned. The bourgeois revolution transformed the States General into the National Assembly, but the revolution would have been lost without the intervention of the popular elements both in the urban and the rural areas. It is a crowd of people in Paris which saved the revolution, as did the number of peasant insurrections in the countryside. After the National Assembly started its session, between the 4th and 11th of August, a series of legislation destroyed what remained of the feudal regime in France. On 4th of August, Vicomte de Noailles made a series of proposals which, apart from destroying the feudal regime, established fiscal equality, equality of rights, freedom from arbitrary arrest, freedom of expression, etc. What was ended was the feudal dues which were so hateful to the peasants. On 26th of August, the Assembly declared the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It was a noble document on which the French Revolution and the working of the Constitution were to be based. The document clearly showed the impact of enlightenment. We had in the first lecture looked at the role of enlightenment in the French Revolution. The ideas of men like Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot had come out very clearly in the assertion of the principles in this declaration. The declaration had 17 articles. It very closely echoed Rousseau when it said, "All men are born free and equal." Some rights were described as imprescribable rights. These were liberty, equality, freedom from arbitrary arrest, freedom of expression and of the press, the right to own property. In fact, the right to own property was described as sacred, inalienable, and inviolable. The document also talked of the separation of powers amongst the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, echoing here the ideas of Montesquieu. Law was to be enacted by an assembly which would be elected by the people. And law would be an expression of the general will. Sovereignty would reside in the nation, meaning the entire people, not on the king. So an entire new basis was created for the restructuring of France politically and legally and constitutionally. As Lefebvre has put it, proclaiming the liberty, equality, and national sovereignty, the document virtually announced the death of the old regime, which had already been put to an end by the intervention of the popular elements in France. It is important to note that this was considered by Michelet, an historian of the 19th century, as the credo of a new age. The king accepted neither the declaration nor the proposals for change which were mooted between 4th and 11th of August. There was still a fear and an anxiety amongst the people that the king and the aristocrats were still continuing their conspiracy to defeat the revolution. In October, there was a fresh insurrection. On 5th of October, people, particularly women, from the faubourg or the suburbs of Saint-Antoine and Les Halles, they assembled at the Hôtel de Ville, which was the town hall, and elected leader, as one of the old Bastille hands as their leader, and marched to Versailles where the king was residing to bring back, in their own words, the baker, the baker's wife and the baker's boy. The allusion was very clear. They wanted the king as the provider of bread to come back. Forced with a popular fervor, revolutionary fervor indeed, the king was obliged to return to Versailles, to Paris, as did the assembly. The constitution making was started immediately. It took 2 years, and the constitution was promulgated ultimately in 1791. It affected different aspects of France's life: political, legal, economic, judicial, and legislative. It started by changing the title of the king. The king was known as Louis, by the grace of God, King of France and Navarre. It was now changed to Louis, by the grace of God and the constitutional will of the people, the King of the French. The nuances of this declaration is very significant indeed. It was clearly stated that the king was not the king of a territory, but the king was the king of a people. The constitution established a constitutional monarchy. Monarchy was not dispensed with. The king still retained sufficient power. He was given a civil list of about 25 million livres, which was substantial. He had the right to appoint the ambassadors, the ministers, the generals, etc. So he retained executive authority, but in reality, most of his orders had to be signed by or countersigned by a minister, and the minister was responsible somewhat to the assembly. Though the assembly was not proposed to be like a parliament, but it was also given substantial power. So the king's power was theoretical, but theoretically at least he still retained enough power. We come to the legislature. There would be a single chamber legislature. It would be called the Legislative Assembly. It is when we come to the question of the political nation that was to select or elect this legislature that we clearly see the impact of the bourgeois domination. The bourgeoisie, as the most articulate, the most important part of the third estate, clearly had the lead in doing this. The entire people of France were divided into two categories: active citizens, those who had property, and passive citizens, those who did not have property. Franchise was given only to the active citizens, thereby excluding the majority of Frenchmen, like domestic servants and people who did not own any property. First, about 4 million people would select 50,000 electors. To be a voter at the primary level, one had to pay at least 3 days' wages as tax. To become an elector, that is to be one of the 50,000, one had to give at least 10 days' wages as tax. And to become a deputy, that is a member of the assembly, one had to pay at least 50 livres per annum as taxes. As Marat had said, the aristocracy of birth was indeed substituted by the aristocracy of wealth. So the constitution provided for a monarch and an assembly which would be elected by a section, the propertied section of French men. Women, of course, had no right to vote. The legal system was to be changed in the sense that there would be no longer arbitrary arrest of people. People would have the right to defend themselves. The judges would be elected. There would be a justice of the peace in every canton. There would be 2 appeal courts at the national level. France earlier had administrative anarchy. in the sense there were different kinds of provinces. Some were known as pays d'etat, others were known as pays d'élection, meaning some provinces had a provincial estates, others did not. Now this anarchy was sought to be ended by reconstituting France into 83 departments. Départements or departments were the new provinces in a way. The provinces would do away with the system of intendants, another very hated official of the Ancien regime, introduced by Louis XIV in the 17th century. They were virtually the arbitrary governors of the provinces. The provinces will have a general council, an executive council, and a procureur general. The departments will be divided into arrondissement or district, and then there will be cantons. The municipal government was in the hand of the communes, and the mayors would be elected as head of the communes. So there was decentralization, but as we shall see later, the decentralization was probably carried a little too far. There wasn't enough financial or fiscal provision for the provinces, and there had been a certain lack of coordination between the central government and the provincial governments. Now there was a proposal that this can be changed by the confiscation of the church property. Talleyrand, a bishop, had first mooted this idea. That this might bring about a lot more money than the state would be obliged to spend on the church if the church property was confiscated. Now this appeared a very attractive idea, and all church land had been confiscated. It is significant to remember the church owned as much as 1/3 of landed property in France during the Ancien regime. Now this huge amount of land came into the market. This was known as the biens nationaux, or the national property. They were to be sold by auction, and against this church property the assembly decided to issue assignats, or paper currency. It was probably not a very wise move. Indeed, Marat had warned against this, but no one heeded his advice. The assignat, or the paper currency, became essential to pay off the creditors of the state. But very soon it seemed that the value of the assignat was falling. It fell to 87% of its value by July 1791, and it was to fall farther in course of the next years. With regard to the economy, the assembly would have preferred free trade and a removal of control. The toll barriers were removed. Grain trade had been freed earlier, and trade was freed. This obviously helped the bourgeoisie, but the free trade of grain had other implications. It meant that without any control, the prices would also be determined by the market, and that might militate against the interests of the people who were affected by the rise in the bread prices or prices of grain. So this is a point that the assembly could not entirely give their mind to. Coming to the church, there was a degree of anti-clericalism, even anti-Christianity sentiments amongst the revolutionaries. Voltaire's severe anti-clericalism influenced some of the thinking of some of the revolutionaries. Now, the church property had already been taken. Now they introduced what was known as the civil constitution of the clergy. This virtually turned the church into a department of the state. Church did not have any property, therefore the salaries were to be paid by the state. The Pope's connection was totally disowned. There would no longer be 135 bishops, but only 83 corresponding to the 83 departments. The bishops in the provinces would be anointed by the bishop of the capital, and the other bishops would anoint the other priests. There would be no archbishop. The clergy was called upon to take an oath to the constitution. This actually had the impact of dividing France religiously down the middle. A whole lot of people refused to take the oath. Those who took the oath came to be known as the constitutional clergy or the juring clergy. Those who did not take the oath came to be known as the non-juring clergy or the refractory clergy. The Constituent Assembly and thereafter Legislative Assembly made repeated attempts to force the clergy to fall in line, but a section of the non-juring clergy or the refractory clergy remained outside the revolution and indeed got merged with the counter-revolutionary movement, which, though not very strong, persisted right through the revolutionary period and occasionally posed a threat to the revolution. But nevertheless, the Constituent Assembly brought old France to an end, the France of Marche regime to an end, and France was now given a new legal, administrative, social basis on which to work. What is significant is that career was open to talent. Birth would not either qualify or disqualify anyone from any office. It marked very definitely the end of the special privileges which the upper orders enjoyed earlier. While the Constituent Assembly was in session, a few disturbing trends could be seen. One was the possibility of a war. In mid-1791, the King of Austria and the King of Prussia jointly issued the Declaration of Pillnitz. In this they said that if there was any attempt on the life of the king, the European powers would form a coalition and intervene in France. It was clearly seen as a signal for a possible invasion of France by the monarchical powers of Europe. Secondly, the two brothers of the king, Comte d'Artois in Turin and Comte de Provence at Koblenz, were trying to regroup the émigré nobility. The émigré nobility were those aristocrats who started leaving or migrating from France after the success of the revolution. They were quite a handful. And it was widely suspected that this émigré nobility, the two brothers of the king and the monarchical powers of Europe, were conspiring, and they were being aided by the possible upsurge of the counter-revolutionary emotions inside France. There were such indications already. There was a gathering of one of the clubs, the Cordelier Club, at a place called Champ de Mars, or the Field of March. The National Guard opened fire and killed quite a number of people there, injuring many more. Now, it indicated that that stability, political stability, had not yet been achieved in France, that the revolution still had reason to fear from counter-revolution, from monarchical aristocratic conspiracy. And this is how it continued. War had virtually started, and in 1792 there was, in April, there was a declaration of war. Now, while on the one hand we have seen there was this fear of conspiracy of the émigré nobility and the monarchical powers, on the other hand, inside France there was a degree of radicalization. The people who had really propelled the revolution towards success were watching closely. The faubourgs or the suburbs were buzzing with activity. The sections of Paris and the Commune, they were the hub of revolutionary activity of the revolutionary people of France at least. Marat, Jean-Paul Marat's journal, L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, or Jacques Hébert's Le Père Duchesne, the father Duchesne. These were very popular newspapers and were propagating radical views about this time. The Parisian crowd also mingled with each other and with the leaders in the various clubs and political societies that had come up. And it had been, for example, the Jacobin Club, the Cordelier Club, and the other club. What really catalyzed the whole thing was the king's attempt to flight. He tried to leave France, was caught with his family at Varennes, and was brought back. Now, in the assembly there were three groups, the Girondins and the Mountains. The Mountains were called mountains because they occupied the high benches. Now, and in between them were the plains. The Mountain were the radicals. They were with they had the support of the people, the Jacobin Club particularly. And now economic crisis was continuing. The king tried to leave France. The war was continuing. The war had started well for France, but very soon it started going against France. It is around this time that the people decided to act once more. There was an insurrection on 10th of August. The radical sections of Paris, they got together at the Hotel de Ville or the town hall and decided to create the Revolutionary Commune. That was the municipal government of Paris. The assembly was forced to recognize it, and on 10th of August they attacked the Tuileries Palace. The king left the Tuileries Palace and took refuge in the assembly chamber, and the assembly decided to suspend the king for the moment. Thus this insurrection of the 10th August was a culminating point of the revolutionary mobilization of Paris and a response to the fear that the revolution was being threatened by royalist conspiracy. The king's decision to try and flee France had really brought this together. The economic crisis was continuing, and there was a gradual radicalization of politics in Paris at least. There were echoes of this in the provinces as well. The Girondin ministry was still in power, but actually gradually the entire authority came to the hand of the Paris Commune, the Revolutionary Commune. And it's the left-wing, the Mountain or the Jacobin deputies who were calling the shots now. They tried to take action against the émigré nobility, saying that they must return or their land would be confiscated. They once again passed a law asking the people, the non-juring clergy, to take the oath again, otherwise the action would be taken against them. The king vetoed all this, and that was the last straw. It was now decided to destroy the monarchy and overthrow the monarchy and to establish a republic in France. A new assembly would be elected. It would be known as the National Convention. It would be elected on the basis of universal adult male suffrage. All people, not based on property, not property-based franchise, but universal adult male suffrage. And on 22nd of September, the monarchy finally came to an end. France became a republic, and 22nd September was to mark the beginning of a new calendar really. It was the year 1 of the year of the republic. So the revolution had, as it were, turned the full circle. What started as a movement not against the monarchy, but now consumed the monarchy as the revolutionary ideas and revolutionary enthusiasm propelled the revolution towards a republican solution. With the fall of the monarchy, the revolution, it is possible to suggest, entered a new phase. It was still at war with Europe, the war had to be brought to an end, but also the revolution had to be successfully organized now.